Patel is the Pershing Square Professor of Global Health in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's an adjunct professor and joint director of the Center for Chronic Conditions and Injuries at the Public Health Foundation of India. He's the honorary professor at the London School. You're the co-founder of, is it Sangath? How do you say?
Yes, that's correct. Sangath, that's correct.
So it's an Indian NGO which won the MacArthur Foundation International Prize for Creative and Effective Institutions in 2008 and the World Health Organization Public Health Champion of India Award in 2016. You're a fellow of the UK's Academy of Medicinal Sciences, and you've served on several WHO Expert and Government of India committees. Your work on the burden of mental disorders, their association with poverty and social disadvantage, and the use of community resources for the delivery of interventions for their prevention and treatment have been recognized by the Chalmers Medal, the Royal Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in the UK, and the Sarnat Medal, the US National Academy of Medicine, an honorary doctorate from Georgetown University, a Humanitarian Prize, an honorary OB from the UK government, and the Posey Leadership Award. You work in the area of child development and adolescent mental health, and you were listed in Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in 2015, and you are really a global icon in mental health and well-being, and give me great hope for the future. So I am so grateful that you're here and you're able to share your work for the Happiness Agora.
First of all, thank you, Catherine. Thank you for organizing this wonderful day. I've had a chance to dip in and out of some of the talks, and it's been fascinating, and I'm hoping very much that you will have all of these talks available online so people can actually access them. I think they're really a tremendous resource, in fact, for all of us and also for many others who are interested in global mental health. So what I'm hoping to do today in 20 minutes is to really take you on a whirlwind of some of the work that I've been very passionate about, but more importantly, the direction of the work that I plan to take going forward. And really, as a theme of this particular Agora is, it's really focusing on hope for a future of mental health and mental health care, more particularly in my talk, that is going to dramatically transform well-being across the world. So I think this is a slide many of you will have already seen, which is really the very important recognition of mental health in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Here, I've shown you goal number 3, which is the health-specific goal, but of course, mental health is also very relevant to many of the other SDGs. And what I really want to speak about more particularly today is the area of universal health coverage, which specifically addresses the delivery of quality and affordable mental health care services for people who are already affected by a mental health problem. I won't be saying much about prevention and promotion, although of course we all acknowledge that is also extremely important. And in fact, you'll see that recognized in the other SDG targets. Now, I want to start my talk not by telling you about how big the problem is, but more importantly, about the fact that we already know how to deal with it. And very importantly, that we know how to deal with this problem in an affordable and acceptable way in the poorest and least resourced context of the world. It would be fair to say that today we have actually no doubt anymore about the fundamental question on whether or not it is acceptable, feasible, safe, and effective for non-specialist providers, such as the ones you see on this slide, to deliver psychological and social interventions for a whole range of mental health problems. It isn't the case that we have 1 or 2 studies. In fact, we have dozens. At last count, I'd say we had probably more than 70 randomized controlled trials. And for those of you who are researchers, you will know that this is really considered to be the most robust design for any healthcare intervention evaluation. And on this slide, I show you a number of different systematic reviews. There are actually several more that have been published as well, which really have sought to synthesize the evidence that has been generated across these very wide range of contexts and also a fairly broad range of health conditions. What's important for me to highlight is the innovative ways in which global mental health practitioners around the world, but particularly in low-resource settings where this kind of innovation is most likely to take place, have sought to address 3 very fundamental barriers to mental health care. The first is obviously something that I think everyone will be immediately familiar with, and that is the lack of suitably skilled human resources. And I'll turn to some of the solutions in the next slide. The second kind of barrier is the access barrier. It's quite interesting, isn't it? When you think about mental health care, our first impression is that somebody with a problem needs to find a mental health professional sitting in a mental health care facility or in some kind of clinical office in a hospital. And it never really strikes us that this is often a great challenge. It's a great barrier for many people with mental health problems, not only because the problem itself sometimes comes in the way of having to access care, but also many people with mental health problems have tremendous social difficulties, and we completely ignore the fact that these social difficulties make it on a clinic. And so access is about making care available in contexts that are convenient to the person with the problem rather than convenient to the provider. And the third important gap is acceptability. And by this, I often refer to this gap as also the credibility gap. And by this, I mean the very biomedical, narrow, clinical diagnostic approach that dominates the mental health care landscape, that forces people to have diagnoses in order to receive care. And often these diagnoses are jargon terms, really. They're not really founded on any kind of science. They're jargon terms that are often alienating, that often people in the general community do not understand, or they even fear. And they often therefore reject the mental health care that is consequent to that, because in fact they reject the diagnosis. That's just one example of how a highly biomedical conversation around mental ill health is really not acceptable to the majority of people with mental health problems. And in many ways, the kinds of innovations that global mental health practitioners have used have addressed these three barriers and redefined mental health care completely, in my mind. They've redefined, for example, the reason why one gives mental health care. It isn't necessary, for example, that one has to give care only for those individuals who meet your diagnostic criterion. Indeed, often many of the innovations that you will see are actually free of diagnosis. They really are largely focusing on people's experience to stress, and perhaps most importantly, the impairments and impact that this has on their daily lives. Where is mental health care provided? Pretty much anywhere which is convenient to the person who's affected. One of the most innovative examples of doing that is at home. Now, some people may balk at this idea, can we really afford a mental health care in people's own homes? Well, I would argue, why not? We're doing that with TB, we're doing that with many other human health conditions, but why not mental health care? And when this care is delivered at home, you have extremely high, not surprisingly, very high adherence rates with interventions, particularly psychological and social interventions. But you can also deliver mental health care in a variety of other settings, such as religious institutions, schools, police stations, and so on. Importantly, of course, primary health care is one that I should also mention. What I think it's important to emphasize that most global mental health interventions almost always address not just the psychological suffering that is associated with mental health problems, but also the social determinants that are typically coexisting with them. It's extremely artificial, for example, to deal with a woman's depression when she has to return home to a violent partner. It's also very artificial to say we're going to refer you to a social worker for that when there are no social workers in most parts of the world, or accessing a social worker is just as difficult and convoluted as accessing a mental health provider. So we really believe in a single holistic solution that is tailored to that person's comprehensive needs. This is, of course, in the best spirit of the idea of person-centered care. Pretty much anyone, as you can see on the slide, anyone who is trained to deliver these interventions, has achieved competency, and very importantly, has been supervised and is being supervised, not by some expert, but typically the supervision is done through peer supervision. And how very often it's important to remember that these sorts of interventions are part of a mix of services that typically always include specialist care for those who need it. So this is really a question of collaborative and coordinated care that is seeking to extend care beyond the facility, beyond mental health professionals, into the larger population, but not working in exclusion of the mental health care system. There's been terrific impact of this enormous body of evidence on policy and practice. For example, the World Bank's Disease Control Priorities Network now recommends many of these interventions for scale up. My own work, of course, as you know, I have been very passionate about community health workers, and the second edition of my book, written with my colleague Charlotte Hanlon, really incorporates the first edition I'd written nearly 20 years ago, at which time there was very little real empirical evidence from low resource context on about these ideas. But I'm delighted now that the second edition really captures a very large amount of that evidence within a much rewritten and revised volume. And I should just tell you upfront that this is actually free, available from the Cambridge University Press website. And then, of course, the World Health Organization's Comprehensive Mental Health Action Plan, which I'm thinking Shekhar must have talked about in his talk. Now let me turn to some reality checks. The reality check, of course, is most people in most parts of the world do not receive any of these interventions. Here you see the coverage of minimally effective treatment for 3 leading mental health conditions. In low and middle income countries, you can see more than 95% of people do not receive these interventions. But astonishingly, the rates of coverage are not that great in high income countries either, where about 70% of people do not receive effective intervention. And this is in spite of the fact that these countries enjoy 1,000-fold greater resources for mental health. And the point I want to make here and emphasize here, that those of us who think that the solution to mental health problems in the population are throwing more money at more mental health professionals should look carefully at this slide, because there is no evidence that, in fact, that is going to lead to any significant reduction in coverage of mental health care. Indeed, today mental health problems, as recently as just last year, are the leading causes not just of sickness, which is something that we're well attuned to hearing about, but death. Here we have an example from a country that I spent half my time in, India, where suicides are now the leading cause of death in young people. Indeed, they're leading cause of death in young people in most countries of the world. And in the US, the country where I spent the other half of my life, another kind of mental health problem, opiate dependence, is now the leading cause of death in this country, in young people. And of course, when care is accessed, you continue to see such horrifying images as on this slide, where people have their basic human rights robbed of them, basic rights of dignity, freedom, right to live a life without being tortured and abused, which are rights which are taken away from them when they find themselves in mental hospitals, such as you see images on the outer side of this slide, or in the community where you see this gentleman who has been chained to a tree. Of course, cages are not just seen in mental hospitals in countries in the rich world. We have shut down these hospitals, which is a good thing, particularly in the context of what those hospitals look like. But sadly, of course, what we've done is we've effectively replaced those hospitals with prisons, so that in the US, a very large number of people with serious mental illness today call prisons their home rather than a place of shelter, a place of recovery. It's with this background that last year, 28 of us joined hands, and over 3 years, we worked on reimagining what mental health should look like, particularly in the era of sustainable development, where for the first time, mental health had been acknowledged as one of the key sustainable development targets. And with that in mind, we spent 3 years thinking about why, despite all the knowledge that I've shared with you earlier, we still had such little traction on the ground. We decided that we needed to broaden our vision from just improving access to care, which of course was an unfinished business by a long shot, but to really be more ambitious, that we wanted to focus on reducing the global burden of suffering due to mental health problems through concerted actions to both prevent as well as improve access to quality care. But more importantly, we thought it was time for us to fundamentally reframe mental health. And I want to spend a couple of moments now thinking about what that reframing might look like. We thought of 3 very particular ways in which we would reframe mental health. The first is to embrace the fact that mental health is not a binary. We have spent more than 30 or 40 years, in many ways, trying to ally ourselves with the rest of medicine, which is very accustomed to dividing people into people with and without a disorder. In order to anchor psychiatry's roots in medicine, we adopted the same approach. The approach of othering, you have a mental disorder and I am concerned about your well-being, as opposed to the reality that mental health is a continuum, that each and every one of us at this very moment lies somewhere on that continuum, from well-being through to distress, through to having a clinically significant conditions, all the way to the extreme where our mental health problems are enduring and profoundly disabling. Depending on where we are on that continuum, we can practice a different kind of intervention, either one that seeks us to promote our mental health and stay well, or at the other end of the continuum that seeks to promote inclusion in everyday life. We need to embrace the dimensional approach, and there's a practical way of doing that, which I'll describe in a moment. The second important principle is that of the convergent approach to understanding the nature of mental health problems. For far too long, our field has been divided by those who claim that this is entirely a brain disease with biological underpinnings, or an apparent conflict with those who say this is entirely a social disorder, which is entirely the result of the social worlds we live in. The truth, of course, lies in both of these different approaches. And the approach of convergence really seeks to combine these two by using novel understandings of neurodevelopment to explain why, in particular, it is social adversities in the first 2 decades of life, particularly childhood, which explain our adult mental health and well-being, due to the fact that social factors operating during the early years have a profound impact on the developing brain, because that is a period of life when the brain is, as it were, the most plastic and responsive to the environment. It isn't therefore the case of, is it my brain or is it my environment? Obviously, it's both, but we now have a much better understanding of how these interact with one another. And then we have the rights-based approach. And the rights-based approach, of course, is one that champions not only the right to be protected from harms to our mental health, for example, when we're escaping conflict, but when one is affected by a mental health problem, the right to choice. We deserve the right to choice, to different approaches to recover, the right to dignity, and the right to freedom. These are fundamental rights that are afforded to people with physical health problems, and they are equally applicable to people with mental health problems. The Commission identified 4 innovative strategies to realize this ambitious re-envisioning of mental health. The first is, I've already talked about this, there is no longer a question of whether this is an effective and safe strategy. This is a well-proven fact now. We really need to be moving beyond to implementation of these interventions. We also need to embrace digital platforms. Here, the evidence is at a much earlier stage. Nevertheless, it's growing very fast. Digital platforms for both providers as well as for people in the population, including those who are affected by mental health problems. We need to recognize that a one-size-fits-all does not work for mental health problems, and balanced care, that is to say, care which balances people's severity of needs with the kind of care they deserve and need, is the most innovative way for a population mental health program. And finally, and perhaps this is where mental health care has really been quite innovative as compared to all other areas of healthcare, in engaging the community, particularly people with a lived experience. And I know soon after me, Charlene Sankel will be talking, and I'm sure she'll say a lot more about this particular essential foundation of the mental health care system. Coming to an end now, I would say that returning to my earlier topic about the future of mental health care within the context of universal health coverage, if I had to apply this reframing approach and these innovations to universal health care, then I would say that these should be the key principles. That we need to take a life course approach. It's about accompanying a person through their life course from childhood into old age, recognizing that social factors operating across the life course will determine our well-being. Secondly, we need to recognize that not everyone with a mental health problem needs a clinical intervention from a specialist provider. In fact, my estimate, it's probably a very small minority. However, if we adopt a stage model, we recognize that people with distress can actually be helped through a foundation of self-help and community health worker delivered psychosocial interventions. This is very much in line with a person-centered chronic conditions approach, which also recognizes that we must holistically address mental health with physical health problems, and indeed health problems with social determinants concurrently, if we're really going to provide a person-centered care approach. And finally, and I've already referred to this, we must consider mental health care a right, not a charity, not something we're doing as a favor to you, but as a fundamental right for humanity. Ultimately, we need to reframe mental health as a global public good. And this is really my hope for the future, that we see mental health not just as a narrow medical condition that is the purview of psychiatrists and other mental health professionals who dole out medicines and treatments, but instead a universal human asset, something that is the center of our personhood, but one which is also indivisible from all other aspects of our well-being. Importantly, this is an issue that is of relevance to all people in all countries, not just in developing countries. This is especially relevant to young people when most mental health problems arise, and I mentioned to you why, and is a crucial contributor to the new notion that the World Bank has initiated on human capital. I think Patricia may have spoken about that in the morning, because what is human capital if it is not driven by our mental health? I want to end by just telling you a few remarks about the work that we are doing at Harvard. Shekhar may have referred to this. We've launched a cross-university initiative last year. And our goal really is to examine how we can address mental health and mental ill health really by an interdisciplinary approach that brings together the very many different scholarly perspectives on mental health, so that we can really address this issue in the way it deserves to be addressed from a cross-disciplinary approach. We have a number of signature work packages that really continue to build on the Lancet Commission. The first is a digital platform that we hope to announce in the very near future to build a mental health workforce globally by empowering them with skills and knowledge and tools to deliver psychological interventions. A countdown mechanism to hold countries accountable through a comprehensive monitoring and reporting system that can be used globally, not just at the country level, but also, for example, in the US at the level of individual states. A global mental health consultancy to build leadership and capacity in mental health care systems, for example, through an executive leadership program for scaling up mental health care. And finally, and we'll be hosting our first meeting on this to promote a rights-based perspective on supported decision-making. So really trying to address how we can operationalize the ideas around supported decision-making, the values of supported decision-making in the real world, particularly in low-resource settings. This is my last slide, and I'll just leave it for you to read. And I'm going to end there, Catherine. I understand that I'm running out of time. I have only 5 minutes, but I'll stop there, and I'm happy to engage in a conversation from here on.
Wonderful. Vikram, thank you so much. I love how you speak to the continuum of care and the continuum of mental health. It's not, you either have a mental health disorder or you don't, but it's really, we all have a continuum of brain health, and also the care in the home, I think, is really important. This is such an innovative approach to mental health. Your presentation and the overall kind of reframing of it and how we think about it and care for people. So I really appreciate it, and great perspective for the broader community as it relates to happiness.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Yes, and you're also, we'll be speaking with Charlene now, but you're also, you started the Global Mental Health Movement, which I've been an advisor for, and it's just a really powerful global movement for mental health that organizations around the world can join, and individuals that are interested in gathering and creating more powerful momentum in the space. And yeah, you've just been such a great leader in the space, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. It's, you know, talking about the movement is something I'm very passionate about. You know, Charlene will start very shortly. It's something that I hold very dear to my heart, especially one of the things that I'm most thrilled about is that for the last 5 years, more than nearly half its existence, the movement has been led by a person with a lived experience from the Global South. And to me, that had always been the vision, that people with a lived experience lead a coalition that includes people like myself who come from a more professional interest in this area.
Absolutely, and it's been extraordinary. I mean, it's not funded, it's a collective group of individuals. There is an infrastructure, there is no infrastructure, it's really equal, and like you said, it's led by lived experience. It's just been a really great thing to be a part of, and I've so appreciated that as well. And I think it's really helped move the agenda from a lived experience perspective forward, which has been so important. And I'm seeing that more and more throughout all the talks today and just in the global landscape of mental health. So been a great leader in that too.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much.
Yes, all right. So from that, we'll bring in Charlene, and I wish you a wonderful day, and thank you again for participating.
Thanks. Thank you, Catherine. Bye-bye.
Bye.